right, we are live. Oh my gosh, this is the inaugural Democratic Dilemma Power Hour. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, audience. Thank you so much for our panel discussion to talk about education, because we need in Indiana to be talking about education. Education is on the forefront of what happens in our communities, giving our kids that opportunity to grow into well-productive, successful, feel-good adults. So, welcome, everybody. I'm super excited to have these conversations with these highly respected community members and experts in their field. We've got Devon Wellington, Indiana House seat candidate for 29, and a Mad Voters activist on the ground who specializes in education. Bruce Lesley, who's the president of First Focus on Children, who's going to give us that national perspective on the impact of children of these legislation and policies. And then Josh Cowen, who is the author of Privatization, how basically we're privatizing our education with school vouchers. He will be joining us in a few minutes at 12:30 because he did get pulled into a congressional meeting. So, which is super exciting. Maybe we'll have some hot takes when he joins us. So, let me give you a little bit introduction, like why are we here, why are we doing this? One, we need to get better set up to talk about these issues as the election gets closer. And two, Josh and I got together because we realized in our movement, we're missing some framing and messaging opportunities. We're going to talk policy here. We're going to get into the weeds a little bit, but that's not how we move voters. It's emotions, it's impact. And that's where we need to start reframing our conversations. We know Democrats have the solution to these problems. The question we need to ask ourselves is, why is the GOP louder? Why are they owning the narrative when they're not delivering the results? And you're going to hear me get really wonky about that at times. To set us up for the conversation today, one thing I'd like to really hone in on, you're going to hear me say this over and over the next few months. 19 million voters voted in 2020 for Biden, and those same 19 million voters did not show up for Harris. We did not give them a reason to get off the couch and move to the polls. That is our job that we have to hone in. Three of the pillars. We can talk about, well, you've heard all the hot takes about who moved, who did it, young voters, male voters, Latino voters. But there's really three pillars that are circulating, that have surfaced rather with the experts and downloading on, with a lot of us, of the three whys. The three whys are, we didn't move them because we don't own the economic conversation. And this impacts our children. They own the right-wing media, and we're not good at networking ourselves together and continuously talking about the conversation. And three, we are movement folks. We like to get behind an issue, and we did not have a clear conversation about economics, economic social justice, the Gaza, and immigration. So today we're really going to talk about education, which ties into that economic argument, and start owning that economic. So without further ado, I am going to toss it over to Devon to give her introduction, and then to Bruce, and we'll get at it. So Devon, welcome.
Hi, yes, thank you for having me. My name is Devon Wellington. I am a House Representative candidate in District 29, and I'm also, my background's in education policy, so I've spent time doing policy work at the federal level. I interned at the U.S. Department of Education when I was in graduate school, and then after that worked with a research organization very closely with the U.S. Department of Education, specifically in their Office of Special Education Programs. And that gave me a really wonderful education in terms of how the federal government is supposed to be functioning within our schools and how they're supposed to interface with states, what their role actually is, which I think is often misunderstood by the everyday person. And now the work I currently do more closely focuses on states, because even though we don't maybe have a federal government who's as concerned about oversight of federal education dollars or has a different plan for education, laws still stand, right? There are still regulations and laws that are requirements. And so states who are trying to be proactive about that, I go in and advise them with, what are the policies and procedures they're going to need to be compliant? Where are they at right now? And just guide them through that process to make sure that they're prepared to enforce those laws at a state level. I've also worked with districts and things like that. So, and then
awesome.
now I also do in a separate role, grassroots advocacy work for Indiana.
Yes, you do. You keep us informed, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So Bruce, I'd love to hear and give us your introduction.
Sure. I'm Bruce Lesley. I'm the president of First Focus on Children, and we're an advocacy group focused mostly on federal policy, but also on state. So we have a lot of partners, state and local partners across the country that we work very closely with. And we really are trying to make, kids are often invisible in these debates. And we are really trying to make kids a greater priority and attention to their issues and actually giving them voice to, their lives and what's going on. And unfortunately, politicians often ignore them. And so that's our role, is to try to lift up their voice and their needs, their concerns across the whole array of policy issues. So education, health, early childhood, et cetera.
Yeah, that's awesome. Folks, if you're listening, please follow Bruce on his Substack, Kids Can't Wait. That's how I got introduced to Bruce, and he really lays it out there. And a lot of those things are impacting us here right in Indiana. Okay, Devon, let's start with you. Let's start talking about what's happening in the state of Indiana with our education and our rapid session right now. They pulled the session forward, and I say in air quotes, to address the redistricting. We lost 2 weeks, so now the bills are coming at us fast and furious. Yes. So could you give us a little bit of rundown of what our children and education and what's happening in that space?
Yeah, there's a couple overarching themes, and you see the themes coming from both the House and the Senate side, and they are bifurcated between different pieces of legislation. And we see things that get struck from one bill on the House or on the Senate side. Just yesterday this happened, and then added to a bill on the House side. So It can be really challenging to follow along with all of this, which is kind of the point. And that's frustrating for everyday voters. It's frustrating for me. It's part of the reason why I'm running, because I don't think that that's fair. However, the overarching themes are culture war issues, things like Christian nationalism, things that we've actually had introduced before, it's been knocked down before. And I think the point of introducing it again and again and again is twofold. The first is they anticipate that people will start to kind of feel desensitized. So things like 10 Commandments in the classroom. Okay, this has been proposed before, it has not passed before, and yet we are here again. Okay, and the strategy is if you yell loud enough and long enough, people will just give up and be like, fine, whatever, right? The second thing is that it also works as a really great distraction tactic and sort of a way to think about like, well, this is really bad, but if we can't get this, maybe we'll get this, but this is also still not great. So there's a lot of legislation being proposed around, I want to say blurring, but it's also, I feel like too generous a word, the separation of church and state. And it's really interesting too, because in terms of having these religious pieces, or these pieces of legislation that introduce religion into the school, even within Christianity, there's a lot of people who disagree on what is right and wrong, right? So even parents who might feel like, oh, maybe, okay, I guess the 10 Commandments aren't so bad. You have how is that being taught? Right? Maybe someone else's understanding of that is not your understanding of how that would play a role, or how, one of the other pieces introduced was talking about how civics the Bible should be included in civics education, but you can't talk about like racism or sexism or slavery, which is a little bit ironic because all those are all things that are included in the Bible. So I don't know how you talk about the Bible and not talk about those things.
I know.
But also then slipped into that same piece of legislation is, oh yeah, and also we're not teaching anything except for you have to wait until marriage to have children. Okay, they don't even say sex education. That's not even a word they use. It's no children until marriage. Okay, your family might feel that way. But if we're following evidence, and we have countless examples of what the evidence tells us in terms of preventing unwanted pregnancies, it's not that. Like, that's not the solution. And so one of the huge challenges that we have in terms of legislation is exactly what you talked about, which is the emotion behind it. Because there are people proposing on the Senate committees and the House committees for education that have no background in best practice or educational policies or using that data to inform the legislation that they propose. And in fact, yesterday I was watching a committee hearing, and there was people in the committee asking questions of the chair of the House committee, and it was a lot of like, we'll figure that out later.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like, no,
That's
no,
not
no,
the
no,
first
no.
time I've seen that. Yeah. That's not the first time I've seen that. It happens many, many times.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's so frustrating. It's like, no, we got to. This is the purpose of this meeting right now. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh, well, but then when, a Democrat asked to change one word from shall to may, it was like, that's way too restrictive. And you're like, no, we're trying to introduce more of the democratic process into it. We're trying to give more local control. So a lot of these pieces of legislation also take away local control. And that definitely comes into play when it comes to voucher systems as we know it. I am so excited to hear what you guys think about this terminology, because I really feel the need to use different wording than school choice vouchers, because it sounds great, right? It sounds common sense. Why wouldn't you want a parent to be able to choose where their child goes to school? And that's not really the argument we're even trying to have, right?
Yeah, you so brought up something that I want to talk about when Josh joins the conversation, because if you haven't read his book, he really talks about evidence. Where the hell is the evidence that shows that these voucher programs, these charter schools work? For example, Indiana, let's just take it, and I'm going to toss it over to you, Bruce, after this. In 2025, our graduation rates for our high school seniors, traditional public schools graduated 93.99%, 93.9%. Our charter schools only graduated 64.1%. Where's the evidence in that the charter schools are working for our children? So I think you're hitting the nail on the head that, they're the thematic approach, the way they address this. There's no evidence to back it up. But I would also argue we're not holding strong and being bold enough to challenge them. So Bruce, when you hear all this stuff, when you hear the things that are happening in our community, I was talking to Josh yesterday, and he was flabbergasted that we in Indiana, children do not have to show up to kindergarten or report to school until they're 7 years old.
Oh, I didn't know that either.
So when you talk about setting our kids up for success in the future and everything you see, jump in and tell us what's going on in the bigger picture when the way we're framing our legislation and what we're doing here in Indiana.
Yeah, I would say that I think that one of the things that advocates for children and families have maybe made a mistake on, but then also the problem that we have with our political leadership is that, I'll start with the political leadership, is that the consultants to politicians have told them, well, kids don't vote, they don't have political action committees, they're not, so they don't have a PAC, they don't have lobbyists. So, we're going to ignore their issues, and we're going to only focus on parents. The problem there is that there's been studies that show that when you think about policy issues and deservedness, like who deserves to get federal support, kids are the second highest ranked group of all groups. So it's veterans and children. So,
Interesting.
So if people have in their head, like, who's deserving, they absolutely believe kids are. And yet the framing often is around the parents. And that's where people have different takes on things. And so if you look at, for example, if you frame the child tax credit as a children's issue, support's 83-13.
Yeah.
If you frame it more about, well, should the child tax credit go and potentially have a work requirement, blah, 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 and you start talking about the adult kinds of issues, it drops to 54-46. So you go from plus 70 to plus 8. So centering children in these kinds of conversations is often key. And I think sometimes when we talk about education in this country, politicians are talking about parents and teachers and all kinds of other people, and the focus is often like children sometimes don't even come up, and you're like, how is that possible? I mean, education is all about children. And so, and when you do that, I think that's where things change, because people do believe that children should have adequate resources. Schools need adequate resources to provide a comprehensive education. There is no, I mean, people are not clamoring for book bans. People are not clamoring for the Ten Commandments, but in the absence of a conversation, so like this is where I think you can see this happening is for example in 2020, Democrats won parents at the presidential level by I think it was 6 points, and then in 2024 they lost parents by 8 points. Well, I would argue that that was because there was no conversation directed at parents about children's issues and children and families issues. And so consequently then $200 million in ads were run on, on culture war themes like LGBTQ kids and stuff like that. And toward demonizing certain pockets of kids, immigrant kids, LGBTQ kids, etc. And if that's the frame, then if that's all that people hear and people are then being told, this election is about this, then it's a whole different conversation. Whereas if you're talking to people about, it's about healthcare for children, nutrition for kids, early childhood, childcare, and public education. Schools used to be the top issue that people talk about, and at the state level, it should be the predominant issue, and unfortunately, so often it's not. And in the void, in the lack of conversation, then culture wars rear its head, and I think that's been the problem, is we aren't having what is it that kids really need, and so I think consequently and then the agenda then of the other side is around abandonment, right? So do not trust your teachers. We're going to micromanage them. We're going to give them the Ten Commandments, and we're going to do book bans and all that kind of stuff. Do not trust your pediatricians. You need to do research on whether kids should be getting vaccines, blah, 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 blah. And it's, don't even trust your food. You should do research on, the different dyes and things like that. Parents actually want those people as partners. Parents see their pediatrician as a partner, their teacher as a partner, their childcare worker, their early childhood person. Like, you love those people as a parent. They're fundamentally important to you, and you rely upon them. And what's the agenda here is to do organized abandonment, so that we're going to isolate parents and we're going to leave them to themselves. And it is exhausting and frustrating. And yet that's the agenda, because it's an anti-government. It's getting, all experts in government out. And you can see it. You can see it at the federal level when the Department of Health and Human Services is basically straight out telling you, do not trust experts anymore.
Yeah. That is so true, because when you say about teachers, I know everybody in this audience can name their kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Hayes. I love Mrs. Hayes. I can see her right now. I remember having eye surgery, and my first day back, she was so welcoming. I was one of those kids with lazy eyes, and I remember everything about my kindergarten teacher. Yeah. So we're taking that away. And, somebody mentioned in the comments about evidence doesn't move voters. That is true. That is absolutely true. But us as the messenger have to get better formulating that argument. And I would say, you mentioned TV ads. I want to cut into this a couple times, because we want to give folks and activists where to go with this. You have the evidence that's just take vouchers do not work. And so what we need to do is, governors in states, in the blue states, are doing this really well, because they know they're accountable to education. They're much closer to that. So we know the values of our community, and we know the solutions that we need to solve. Our job as communicators is to find the hook, the crossover, think of that Venn diagram of what is going to move them to come to community meetings, to get better informed, to actually care. And that hook might be their teachers, being attacked by the teachers. That hook might be the fact that from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, you don't know what to do with your kid anymore, your child, because they cut the afternoon program, because the school budget has just been decimated by our Indiana's last budget bill. So I think what we as folks who know the evidence have to figure out what are the values of our community, what are the solutions, whether it's after school program, whether it's childcare, whether it's lunch program, whether it is sports, what's getting cut from our program, and find out how we get that emotional connection to our listeners. And you mentioned something else, Bruce, that I really want to hone in on, and you, Devon, as a candidate. Hi, Josh. As a candidate, we'll talk about is we spent so much money in TV in 2024, and what kills me about spending so much money on TV is candidates that are low on the ground have a better understanding of what's going to move the voters from the couch to polls, right? And we've got folks out there still pushing our candidates to buy in TV. If we can start talking about these educational issues, child issues on a more emotional level, we should be sliding in with digital ads, digital buys, and A/B testing what's going to move our voters now. And that's what we're missing. We're missing the language that you just talked about is stop focusing on parents, focusing impact on kids, A/B test what's going to work in your community. You can't test digital, you can't test TV ads. All you can test is frequency, and that means nothing. So that's what I'm getting out of this conversation. So that's huge. So, Josh, thank you for joining us. How'd it go with your conversation a few minutes ago?
Everything was great. Thanks for having me.
Okay, good. What we were just talking about is Bruce introduced himself, Devon introduced herself. We really talked about what's happening on Indiana on a state level, the impact of children. And what I'd like to see if you can paint the picture is, how do we get here? How do we get here? You've talked in your book about the journey from Brown versus Board of Education. You talked about the Milton Friedman argument, and here we are fast forward with privatizing education. So give the listeners a little bit of your elevator pitch on that quick, why are we here?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me. So sort of the basic story here is that the idea that we should have public investments in schools has at least for the last century, been something that's been largely shared by families across the country. But there's always been some disagreement with that. And since Brown v. Board, a lot of the strongest disagreement with the idea that we should have sort of public spaces that include schools for kids and families. Since Brown v. Board, some of that strongest disagreement came in the resistance to mandatory racial integration. Yeah. But that's kind of the origin story. For where we are today, the stuff that's relevant here, especially in kind of the conversations that are going on around the country right now. Basically, we have a school privatization push because there's a handful of billionaires who wanted it and have wanted it since the 1980s, wanted it since the beginning of the early 90s when these things when school vouchers and then first nonprofit and then for-profit charter schools kind of came online and started to kind of work on this. So, it's not trying to invest in and improve public schools has always been a long-term goal and challenge. One of the things that I'm trying to do right now is make sure, I know I'm jumping in the middle of a conversation, that Democrats are remembering to talk about schools and kids and families and improving what we can invest in together. But all of that said, it remains true, it's always been true, that this sort of, just from the standpoint of where to send taxpayer dollars, the idea that we should send taxpayer dollars to stand up and to bail out, in many cases, private enterprises, private schools, is an idea that originated wholly with a handful of billionaires in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah. I think what kills me is when I was reading through your book is the research they claim is their research, and you look at the privately funded, and I understand in your position that you are privately funded for some researches with grants, but that's the way it works. But when you look at who's funding their research, how do you counteract that? Because I know in Indiana as a candidate, when we talk about the arguments and they throw their research out. They're doing it right now on the state Senate, the state House floor, the Senate floor. We've got anecdotal research that says it works. How do we counteract that when you know that that's the fluff? There's a lot of fluff in there.
It's interesting because like some of the worst results for vouchers specifically have come from research projects led by voucher advocates who the results were so bad they couldn't spin it, so they moved the goalposts. And I'm happy to talk about what that means in a second. But
Yeah.
This is where you see, like, this is not just in education, it's not just when it comes to social services. Like, there is a deep and sustained effort to undermine the entire idea of credibility, of science, of objectivity. The funding stream of the U.S. Department of Education that funds all this work, that helps us know what is working for kids, what isn't working, at least in K-12 schools, has been completely gutted, the Institute for Education Science. So they just stopped asking in any meaningful way. And, part of the reason for that is Democrats can get a little fixated sometimes on, I think, in the other direction, on expertise and sort of, well, the data say this, and not knowing that, you got to be able to talk in a way that makes sense to people. And so the other side on this question has really invested in trying to tell an alternative story. And listen, J.D. Vance said professors are the enemy. They did this when it came to climate science. They would march in a whole series of their own experts to say that, actually, there's no such thing. Global warming is a myth. We've seen this with vaccines right now. Well, vaccines work, vouchers don't. That's what the data say. But to create kind of this deep, sustained distrust of what evidence says. You guys are in Indiana. Indiana's home to some of the largest academic declines we've ever seen in the history of education research, and that comes from the Indiana voucher system. Before it was expanded. What happened sort of historically is about 12 or 13 years ago, these really dreadful academic results started coming out of Louisiana's voucher program. And we'd never seen anything like this before, because usually what happens in education is it just doesn't move the needle one way or the other. Like, Bruce, this, like sometimes we'll program doesn't quite work that well. I've been a part of a lot of evaluations. It's like we say, it didn't hurt, but didn't help. That's not true with vouchers. It actually declined student test scores for kids who switched. But they tried to say that Louisiana was kind of a one-off. Well, there's too much regulation, and it's a little different. Betsy DeVos had to acknowledge the negative Louisiana results because she did. She was Department of Ed secretary at the time, and she said, it's just poorly conceived. Let's look at what happens in Indiana. So then, Indiana, a very different state than Louisiana, right? Looked at your program there, and in fact, now the results weren't quite as negative, but still deeply, deeply negative, almost worse than anything we've seen an intervention do on test scores. So there's something just wrong with this idea. It doesn't work, at least when it comes to academics. It doesn't work, and I think, I still remain a little bit surprised sometimes at how bad the results have been and how little those terrible results mattered when it came to just blowing through and expanding these programs across the country and in your state.
Yeah. Go ahead, Devon. Jump in as a candidate, as an activist. Go ahead.
Yeah, just 2 weeks ago, as an advocate, putting on my advocate hat, I was testifying before the House Committee on Education, and I was cited, as we're going back and forth after my testimony, about how, no, actually, this study shows 160-day gains in reading and something like 114-day gains in math. And it was really funny because it was in the context of I had cited there's a lot of research out there that would validate the idea that these programs aren't working, and then I was told no, we can't generalize like that because I have this study that I want to cite over here that says it works. And I had to say, if I can't generalize, neither can you, because I can bring out just as many studies, if not more, and I would argue a lot more, substantive, valid, reliable studies that would show that the gains are not there. The academic measuring is far more strict in the studies that are happening. Yeah, go ahead, Josh. Sorry.
The thing that if there's one thing that I would say, and I'll try to shut up here and let other stuff, I think that Mary, you're a political strategist. The important thing to know about the way that so-called evidence was accumulated for both vouchers, but also just a series of other policy priorities on the right when it came to families broadly. Those organizations function like political campaigns. and they treat negative results the way political campaigns treat the need for opposition research. So
Yes.
people like the world that I came out of, we try to call balls and strikes. Sometimes we're better at it than others. Sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes I mean, my whole career arguably was built before I kind of take on this role that I'm in now on publishing a lot of results of stuff that just wasn't working super well. In some cases it was, some cases it wasn't. That's just not how the other side approaches research when it
Yeah.
comes to schools, at least. It's very much part and parcel of campaign political operation. And in many cases is actually the same, sometimes the same funders. There's one in particular, I mentioned the Bradley Foundation in my book, which just funds tons and tons of political
Yeah.
operations and research supporting some of these priorities in schools.
Yeah, I would have to add that I'm on a group every other Monday night, and we talk about how the right has risen up. I have to listen, so I take one for the team, the far right podcasts and the Bro Brothers. And last week we had a guest author who just wrote the book on the rise of it's not out yet, but we got some advanced copies and chapters on Tucker Carlson, on the rise of Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, yeah.
And yep,
Who I
and
used to work with, by the way.
oh, interesting. Okay. So what was really interesting, there's a line in chapter 5 where he really talks about that transition and how he crossed over the line about truth. And basically said, there is no line. The line is fake. We impose that line. What Democrats have to really grapple with and understand is I am not advocating that we lie, but we need to be more forthcoming. We need to be more forceful. We need to start owning the messaging and the argument around education in a way that lands with our voters. Because we have a tendency, I see this, and I'd love to hear what you think, Josh and Bruce, that when it comes to kids, parents are given such a false choice, like the defunding of the schools, because this is what they want. They want to defund the schools. Well, parents will say, I got to pull my child. The school's not working. There's 35 kids in the classroom at age 5. That doesn't give my child an education. I've got a choice here. My child's only 5 once. So I'm pulling my child and taking this money and going to a charter school, although that charter school is not going to serve the child either way. So we've set up this dynamic where parents are struggling and then they just kind of don't enter the conversation. They take the kid to the new school. And then when we come in as messengers, candidates are not equipped to really go in and really point out what truly is happening, why their kid is underserved in both places.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'll respond to some of that. I think that part of the agenda here is the isolation of parents, right? And so it's really interesting. I read this really great article about New York, and families spend God knows how much money on prepping their kids and all this stuff to get into certain academies and the whole bit. And they have coaches, and they're spending tens of thousands of dollars to get them, their kid in the elite, academy or whatever. And meanwhile, really, like we put all that money to use for all kids could get, and you wouldn't have to put your kids through that kind of thing. But the idea here is to isolate families and make them only think about their child instead of what all kids need. And so, and I'm from Texas. Like the idea that Texas, who doesn't have an state income tax, doesn't have a lot of revenues, is now going to fund 2 education systems. They're going to fund a public education system, which they're doing very poorly. And then now they're going to fund a private education system is insane. And everyone knows what's going to happen there. And they're going to continue to defund the public system. And then exactly as you said, Mary, and Josh has documented so well in his book, by the way, big shout out for his book. I loved it, is that this is totally the agenda. It's about isolating families and not having them think about what kids all need. It's only about what your kid and how can I get my kid a leg up. And it's destructive to public education, but also it is so pernicious that it's also about what child care center you get into, and then it's this misinformation and basically turning people against the experts or their teachers, their child care workers, their pediatricians, and it's really isolating to parents and families. And at the end of the day, that's not really what parents want, nor is it what kids need.
Yeah, agreed.
I think a couple things. One of the points you were making a second ago, Mary, like the we have to do better, I think, with talking about facts and data and evidence in a way that, obviously, we, unlike the other side, we don't make stuff up, but talking about those pieces of reality that actually like resonate with families and resonate with parents is part of it. I think we also can't gaslight parents, right? And so like this is something that, and this isn't just true with education, right? But like you can't. I think, frankly, like one reason, there's no shortage of opinions about what happened in 24, but like as I understand it, one of the sort of big conversations about the way that the Biden team was messaging on the economy was it was like they were trying to point to all these leading indicators that just was not how families were experiencing the economy. And I would just say that's what's been true with schools too, is like you can't, I mean, God bless the political leaders, including in my own state, who've worked hard to improve investments in public education over time. But if it's not being realized sort of in classrooms, if it's not being realized, if educators are still, in my state, we're the 44, we're 44th in reading, the numbers say on NAEP, but we're also 44th in teacher salaries. So like you gotta kind of things fit together in a way that has to make sense to people. And then the other thing I'd say too is that like, and I'm still trying to puzzle this out, and I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about it, because I'm trying to write and speak a little bit more about this right now. But, talking about these issues in, for whatever reason, the party's really good about, or at least saying the reading the instruction manual, I call it, like we got to talk about kitchen table issues, and then sometimes forget to talk about what those kitchen table issues actually are, rather than just saying, make sure we talk about kitchen table issues. What I mean by that in the school space is like, I think a lot of people believe in the concept of public education. I certainly do. But I mean, I have been in 23 states talking about vouchers, talking about whatever over the last year and a half or so. And like, not a lot of people come up to me and talk about public schools and democracy. Like a lot of books are getting written about it, a lot of think pieces. I've talked about it, I'm sure myself. I talk about it in the book, right? Yeah, there's this really conceptual high order thing. But like people, when they come up after a speech or whatever, it's, maybe democracy is for a parent who's like trying to get their school to pay more attention to their kids' reading needs, just having the school be more responsive is how they experience schools and democracy. Like maybe democracy is being able to count on a little bit of unemployment help if you lose your job. I mean, there's a lot of different ways people experience this stuff. And I think sometimes, like, I'm not saying we should ignore the big picture stuff, the big philosophical stuff, but I worry a little bit that to the extent that folks on my side of the aisle talk about schools, it's often in that really high order way, democracy. But it's just like, you got to talk about the issues that are really landing and stressing kids and families out. And then, affordability is obviously the thing everyone's running around right now on affordability and healthcare. These are really, really important things. And I am not saying don't run on affordability or don't run on healthcare. But what I am saying is that messaging that only talks about affordability and only talks about healthcare and doesn't wrap another piece in, which is schools and childcare, and is missing. It just rings hollow for a good chunk of the country, certainly for parents and families.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, because I think what people forget about Mandani's campaign is he talked about affordability, but he also had 5 pillars that were going to impact affordability. And Josh and I talked about this several times. We're here in Indiana, but I sure as hell can name all those 5 pillars: free buses, childcare, grocery stores. What was the other one? Lunch, housing. Thank you. So we knew what that was underneath. I think to answer your question, and I'd love to hear your, Devon, as a candidate, your response is, we are not training candidates how to talk about education, because again, as I said in the beginning, when I look at it from a strategist standpoint, is what are our values? What are the solutions we're going to solve in our community, that because we're the closest to our voters, and what's the hook that's going to move them, that emotional hook? What are we solving for them, whether it be the after school program? But we're not training our candidates to talk about it, because the other thing, where we had Jennifer McCormick running for governor here in Indiana on an education platform. The reason why we weren't successful is because she was the only one talking about it. When you've got individual candidates out there running on their own platforms, it doesn't penetrate, because everybody's got a different message and is approaching it from a different way. Josh, I'd love to hear your point as the one who's really in the weeds on this one.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems we see a lot when we're working with candidates is something, Josh, that you had mentioned, is that people get caught too much in talking like the larger scale and not to who they're trying to reach. I think that is a big issue as well. Like, they're not talking about their public schools systems, right? Like, I think they're missing the point there. They're talking about, oh, like, look at all this stuff in the news. Like, it's so easy right now to pull that kind of stuff out. And so we're seeing that a lot with our candidates. I think also, to what you're saying, Mary, is we need then the local to support the larger scale. But the problem is the local gets so focused on these other things that we're missing the point across the board. So we need to focus on, okay, what is it that our individual community needs in the public school system? Because yes, the education and schools are struggling across the board, but each county and each district has its own unique things that they're dealing with. So when you just say something blanket, you miss the point. So take the general thing that, Josh, you write about in the book as the like foundation of the story, and then build on the foundation of your town, of the county, of the district. That's where you actually win votes. That's where you actually connect. We're seeing like all the comments you guys have been sending in the chat here are like very specific things about your area, right? And like, how do we connect with your thing? The actual evidence doesn't move people. No, it doesn't move people the same way emotion does. Decisions are always, I mean, this is the negative part of me, but from the marketing side, no decision is made just on evidence. It's made on emotion. So you need to connect that emotional connection from your town, connect the story of your town with these things that we're talking about. That's where you see it come through. And if everybody could do that, then we could see a governor who could actually build upon that for their state story. And now, Devon, I'm curious kind of how you approach this from an actual practical standpoint for your district.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out, because I have this like 30,000 foot up view, right? And I'm looking at what's happening in IPS and what's happening at neighboring districts, and I see what's coming, right? And that's what worries me the most as a policymaker. I also think it's what makes me uniquely qualified to be in the State House, hopefully influencing legislation that would protect education. However, someone said to me today, actually, like, we keep trying to explain the recipe and we just got to talk about the brownie, which is, I think, exactly what you're talking about. We are very lucky that, you know, my district has really good public schools, and we have a superintendent who's super on top of it. And I'm trying to figure out, how do we frame, like, okay, our public schools have a lot of positives. It's not just the fear mongering. It's not just the negative, but like, there are front lines for our kids, right? Those school social workers, teachers, the people in the lunchroom, they're the people who are with our kids and seeing what's happening every day. They're the ones who notice the kids who are hungry, or the kids who are showing up late consistently, or who might not have shoes that fit. They're the, like, we need our schools so desperately. So that's one thing that I'm trying to figure out how to articulate. I would love your guys' input. And just trying to show the positives of school. The other thing I think we talk about, and I know especially in special ed, is like, oh man, these are the most vulnerable kids and they need us the most, and maybe charter or voucher programs won't accept them, and that's all true. However, the education tactics we learn from working with kids in special education help all students. And if you look at like 50% of Fortune 500 CEOs are neurodivergent, 30% of upper management, neurodivergent. The most loyal, best employees, people with disabilities. So we cannot just talk about the negative, and I'm trying to figure out how to do that in a way that like gets people moving and inspires them, because I feel like the negative is so often what ignites those emotions to get people to act.
Yeah, I would add, Devon. So we talked to Gina Clemente. She was the marketing and CMO for Nike and Adidas. And Josh and I had some great conversations with her. And what she was really saying and she has a really good Substack out there called Good Story. And what you're seeing in our world on the other side is the long form is coming back. People want to hear the story. And I think we are afraid as candidates. We have small budgets. We have to small amount of time to get the message out there. We're afraid to tell the story. And that's what we have to start doing. And I also would add is I see this in Indiana, having come from Massachusetts. That's how I got involved in politics, was my eyes got really wide open. What was possible in Massachusetts is not here. For example,
amazing.
And I don't think people know what's out there on the local level here. When you have Indiana spending average $11,000 per public kid, and in Pennsylvania, Josh, we talked to the superintendent and Josh that's coming out on our podcast from Pennsylvania. They're spending average $22,000 per child. Massachusetts is about $19,000. People don't know what's possible, and they're living in their bubbles. And how can we open up that nut on a local level? That would be what we have to do. And it goes back to training candidates to how this is done, because we're not giving the local candidates. David Pepper says this all the time: the power's in the state house, and we consistently focus on swing states, the federal level. Policy happens in Washington. Execution happens on the state level, and we're ignoring our state level candidates.
Yeah, and not to like hit the same thing over and over again, but like the hook is huge. Mary has said it a couple of times. Like that is really how to hammer this in, like in a very practical way. Like if you're a candidate listening to this, whatever your hook is, connecting that to your county's needs and stories. So like we were just working with a candidate up in northern Indiana, up in South Bend area, and I think I saw him on the call actually. Alex, I think, is still here. Yeah, he has a young daughter, right, 7-month-old. So the way we talked about education for him, yes, Alex is still here. The way we talked about education for him was talking about his daughter, right? So what is my daughter going to have for education? Will we still have the type of opportunities that I had when I was here? And he's a young candidate. He's in his 30s. Will my daughter have the opportunities that I treasured here? And so now you're connecting the problem to a story that people can connect with. And so that's a really practical way to do it. Sorry, Bruce, I think I cut you off there.
No. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I'll just build on what you're just saying, in that, that's exactly what in the 2025 races, right, Spanberger and Sherrill did, is we're moms. And they really talked about it, public education in New Jersey and Virginia, and in very profound ways. But to Mary's point too, they talked about sort of the overall agenda around childcare, and they put forth a very comprehensive agenda. And I live in the DC area, so I saw all these ads in the Virginia race. And meanwhile, the Winsome Earl Sears, I think it was like 60% of her ads were culture war ads, and they did not break through because it was actually a very strong agenda that really spoke to people that Spanberger was putting out. And And it was a, very pro public education, childcare, healthcare agenda. And I think that really is a model. And and it was replicated. You also then saw the ads by the state Senate and state legislative candidates in the same market, and they were echoing the same themes. And I think that is exactly what did not happen in 2024 is, so someone put in the chat, well, Harris talked about the child tax credit. She did. Who else did? Like the candidates running for the U.S. Senate and the House were not talking about it because the consultants told them not to because it went away. So it wasn't a win. And it's like, right, but if you're all talking about that, that is very personal to people. That's like money in your pocket. And the polling on that is overwhelming. It's 83-13. So it's shocking sometimes that, and then I'll going back to like, I'm, being from El Paso, when I see people from Texas and I see people from my hometown, the first thing people say is, where are you from? And what people mean is your high school. And so you say, oh, I'm from, and you talk about where your high school is. So it is very much a centered thing in communities to people, and people talk about it that way. And that's what the agenda is trying to get rid of, right? Is if you're not really associated to your school, and then it's all about yourself, then it's some charter school that doesn't really have a community in the same way, or it's a private school that it does have a community, but not in a place-based way, because it's people coming from all kinds of places. So it really is trying to get back to this community and then it's teachers and coaches. I mean, Mary, you said, we all know our kindergarten teacher. We also all know our, coaches. So it's that kind of thing that people understand and connect to.
Also, and I'm sure Josh can talk more to the like the history of all of it and the agenda of, it's trying to, whatever, it's all the racist, agenda that's trying to separate everything. But I think ultimately, like, the tax credit, blah, 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 so boring. Like, who cares that she talked about that? Like, from the marketing side, I don't care. We're assuming people pay way more attention to shit than they actually do. Like, we need to be talking about it in a way that connects with people in a way that they can relate it to their actual lives. Like, when I say tax credit bill, like, whatever, that's not connecting with me unless I can connect it to an actual, what the actual practical way it affects someone's life. And that's the way we need to be talking about it. And especially on a local level. Like, I hate using Kamala as an example. Like, we do it all the time of like, oh, she did this thing wrong or she did this thing right. She's a terrible example for us to use for anything. There are so many things that we could get into this. We could do a whole hour on Kamala. Mary could talk all by herself on Kamala. But I think that we're missing the whole point there, in that, like, when we're talking on a local level, we need to be connecting to people and what affects them. And to loop back, Bruce, to what you had first been talking about the Virginia and the Jersey races, one of the questions that we've gotten on the podcast and we've talked with candidates about is, okay, I'm not a mother, I'm not a father, how do I talk about education? I'm curious all of your takes on it. I know that when we give the advice, we talk about use the stories of your city, of your town, of your county instead. Like, Devon, you said, you had a line in there of like, oh, the kid who doesn't have shoes on. That is a great example of using a story-based way to talk about something. But I'm curious how you guys would approach for people who are here who maybe don't have kids or don't have necessarily that like really practical personal way that they can talk about education.
I don't know that education should be any different than I mean, listen, I'm not a doctor, but like I want everybody to have high quality healthcare access. Like I don't know that I think that's I'm not disputing what you said, but I do like if a candidate's pushing back, you've got to be able to talk about lots of things that I mean, we all had a teacher or we all had some sort of schooling experience. If nothing else, talk about what your own schooling experience was like and how it helped you. And if you don't believe that your educational experience helped you, then there's probably some self-reflection that needs to happen. And if you do find shortcomings, talk about those shortcomings and how you don't want other children to have to go through it. I mean, I think so. That's one thing. But the other thing I would just sort of say is like I don't. Right now, I would settle for just talking about schools and K-12 with the frequency that Republican candidates do. I mean, I will leave to others the specific messaging. I have some ideas. I'm a pretty decent communicator of complicated policy things. I think that's sort of why I've found myself speaking out about a lot of these issues, but not a trained professional in this space. But I do know that, candidates only have so much time, and, I'm not disputing. This is the thing. When I talk to candidates, and I'm doing a lot of interviews myself right now, conversations with candidates all over the country, and they're all good sports about all this. But, when I talk to folks, and then I do a lot of sort of consulting with governor's offices and things like this. Like, sometimes you hear, well, we do talk about schools, and then you look and it's on page 4, or it's agenda item 9. And I can name 5 Republican congressional candidates for whom schools is a top 3 issue for every one Democratic congressional candidate that I can name for whom schools is a top 3 issue. And the reality is it's a spacing thing. So, maybe Kamala shouldn't have talked just about the child tax credit per se or whatever. Like, my thing is, you got to narrow it down. So like I am saying, affordability healthcare schools should be the message right now. Affordability healthcare schools. And, as somebody who ran myself and raised non-trivial amount of money talking about schools before I sort of bowed out and let someone else take the baton, I would get questions. Sometimes you'd get from like the Democratic stakeholder groups who not education aligned, but the activist core and things like that wanted me to be talking about bigger. We got a lot of stuff, a lot of problems right now we got to address. Like, no one is disputing that. But, it's like, well, Josh, you too much about education. What else? Like, well, how many think pieces have you guys all read in the New York Times? I mean, there's one at least once a week in the Times. But like, how many think pieces have you read about, well, the Democrats got to do this, they got to do that, they got to do this to win over swing voters or win over Republicans. All I know is Republicans think schools are a winning issue for them. Like, I disagree with almost everything Republicans say about schools, but they believe that it is an issue for them. And when you see the research on this, surveys have shown a collapsing level of trust for Democrats on the issue of K-12 schools. Like, it's just really clear. And it's mostly driven by Democrats' own voters. And the relative lack of, it's a great set of research, we talk about data and evidence from a research team based at Notre Dame, actually, with just like, where does schools fall on Democratic platforms? It's like the 10th on the drop-down menu. And it's like paragraph 9 in a 15-paragraph speech that they give on the stump or whatever it is. We all know, I did this myself, we all have candidate stump speeches, right? Where is it on the list? And the reality is it's going higher up the Republican candidate list, and K-12 schools are going down on the Democratic list. So I'd just settle for it moving back up to a top tier place. And then we can talk about the messaging piece for sure. But like, so I think that this is part of the challenge is like, and I'll be honest, like the other thing I've heard, and I'll shut up again, but like, I said this in my newsletter on Monday. I think if you get a couple beers in some of the leading national political strategists, they would tell you that if you really care about public education, you care about pre-K, you care about universal school meals, you're going to vote for a Democrat anyway. So there's an incentive for campaign strategists to not, almost to take that vote for granted. And I think the problem with that approach is, first of all, I just think it's wrong, but I also think like it misses the flip side, which is what I was just saying, which is that it assumes that people who did abandon the Democratic Party and did take a look at Trump, despite all the horrific evidence that this guy was going to do this bad stuff for families, didn't move at all because of education, that education wasn't a moving issue that they lost on. And I think that the data are pretty clear that that in fact isn't true, that in fact we did lose voters, particularly black voters and Kamala voters. I saw this poll out from Laksha Jain in the argument released in December that showed that only like 70% of Kamala voters support the Democratic messaging on K-12 schools, which is a lot, except that 100% of Kamala voters voted for Kamala. So 71 is a lot smaller than that, and that number is only 50% among black voters. So like we have like a problem in our own house when it comes to convincing families that we're working for them. And one last thing I'd ask about, because I don't know the answer to this and I'm struggling with it myself, is we're so good on some of the other stuff. Pre-K for all, like let's just make that be everywhere. Damn it, like we got a governor pushing it here, universal school meals. Why are we so good on some of this ancillary stuff and are not able to kind of pull people back in when we're talking about K-12? It's a mystery to me, and I don't know the answer.
Well, Mary, we can't hear you. But yeah, I think that is a trend across the board, too, is we have a problem in our own house. Like, I think education is a huge piece of that. But I think we see this trend happen a lot on the blue side of the aisle, where we get so caught up, or we have so many problems ourselves that we've got to clean our house before we can do anything on the other side. And I think we're seeing that a lot on the education side right now. But I think we're seeing that on a lot of issues. And I think that is a big issue that we're continuing to see, and it's continuing to happen. Mary, did you have something to add? Oh, sorry, Devon.
I, as a candidate, have heard from other candidates that are like, what is the problem with charter and voucher programs? Like, I don't get it. So I think that there is an education that we need on, just baseline on the candidate level, because the messaging is so strong. I said this at the beginning, I feel like we need to have alternative phrases that more accurately capture the outcome really succinctly. Because right now it's like school choice, sure, why not? That sounds democratic.
I just say that vouchers are education's version of predatory lending, and it's the school's choice, not school choice. And at some point you just have to kind of call it out and say, like, well, I'm all for choice. Listen, I am a supporter of open enrollment plans and interdistrict choice. I'm even, supporter, maybe too strong a word. I can live with nonprofit charters at this point. Some of those organizations are doing good work, and frankly, a lot of Democrats support them, particularly in Black community. I'll draw the line at I think we need to put a moratorium on the for-profit, especially private equity-owned charters. There's different groups. This is really in the weeds, right? But like, the reality is, like, your voucher is only as good as the school you're able to get yourself into or your child into. And, if we have schools turning kids down because their families are LGBTQ families they're turning kids down because they have special needs, which is the most common way that private schools discriminate. We got schools, and this is well documented reporting across the country now, schools making families sign what they call sexual morality pledges. We all know what that means, to make sure that the family looks and believes maybe the right way. Been reports of families who are divorced getting turned down because it's not with the school's alignment. So, like, there's any reason that vouchers are the school's choice. It's not school choice, and I think that piece of it is part of it. And in some places, all you need to do is say it's Betsy DeVos's life's work, and that will explain it enough for some people, at least in my state.
Do you guys think, because in Indiana we have a nice, healthy history of outside large donors investing in candidates that are, for privatization. And as I've been talking to people about this, I've realized that people sort of expect corruption in politics, so they're not really surprised by that. And it doesn't necessarily move the needle.
I think.
How do you frame that, Josh?
I mean, I've seen sort of just with experientially myself, and then also just polling that I've seen both internally and externally on this. I think where it goes back to the democracy question, and I don't want to, throw shade at people who get up every morning and fight for our democracy. That's not what I'm trying to talk about here. But just when we're talking about a concrete policy issue like schools, you really have to talk about it in terms of how it's landing for my family. And so, when you do batteries of tests on these questions, it's like privatization as a concept may get some people worked up, but it doesn't get everybody worked up. Certainly not any more than the idea of big government does. The idea that schools discriminate does bother some people. The idea that it could discriminate against my kid bothers them more. The idea that private schools take money from public schools bothers people to some extent. The idea that my own school could lose funding or shut down because of vouchers bothers them even more. And it's not cynical. It's just the reality is people have to understand how it lands. I'll give a counterexample. I spent some time in Kentucky during the fall of 24. I was there 3 different times, did a press conference with Andy Bashir and Randy Weingarten, and we were trying to kind of push back on this DeVos, talk about outside money, this DeVos push in Kentucky and south of you guys to push vouchers through on a constitutional amendment. Red as hell state, right? And 65% of voters on Election Day 2024 voted for Donald Trump in Kentucky. And 65% of voters voted against vouchers on the same exact ballot, the same exact day. All 120 counties voted against vouchers, 119 of those by double digits. And, the message that I took from that was, Bashir is a non-apologetic, forceful reinvestment in public schools. But this is a very conservative state. And the message I took from that is the same message you take from the other sort of postmortems about the Biden world and things like that. It's like, how is it helping my family when these leading numbers? I think a lot of people in Kentucky looked at the messaging coming in from DeVos and these Koch groups and things like that. They're like, we don't have a damn private school in my county. How is this thing going to help my family? Mm-hmm. And I don't care that the Diocese of Louisville is trying to get this through the ballot box. How is this helping me in Eastern Appalachia? I think like the lessons there is that people do respond, including conservatives. This is not a red-blue thing even. Vouchers have never survived a statewide initiative on a ballot box anywhere. Anywhere, right? And the flip side of that too, by the way, as a policy matter, vouchers have always been adjacent to reproductive rights as sort of very high levels of priority among some of these right-wing groups. Taking back reproductive rights, I should say, not expanding reproductive rights for these right-wing groups. You saw this in the same way with ballot initiatives on reproductive rights in red states that pass overwhelmingly in many cases, right, while voting for conservatives otherwise. And so I think some of this is like the legwork needs to be done, but people don't like these things when they hear about them. And, I wasn't trying to be snarky, but I said this in, one of my latest newsletters. If somehow the party that is pushing ICE raids and ignoring rising costs for families and is trying to stop childcare funding, Bruce, and and doing nothing about this just epidemic of school shootings, manages to convince families and wants to throw families off healthcare, manages to convince families that they have better ideas when it comes to K-12 schools. Like, I think that's an us problem. I think that's a Democrat problem. Like, if we manage to drop the ball, given the messaging coming out of the other side on this, I think people respond when they know that these things are terrible, do respond to them. But doing that work is really hard, especially with all the other stuff that's going on right now. And I think the flip side of the coin has to be, what is your positive message for making sure that you do have a school that delivers for your family?
Yeah, and I would totally echo all of that 100%. And I would say, as having grown up in Texas and seen mean, some of the ways that Texans really pushed back. I mean, at the end of the day, political power, they pushed it through. But the idea that, people did beat it back for years and years in Texas because what they were saying is like, we don't want these outside. This is the Texas way, and that is exactly what they did in Kentucky. This is the Kentucky way, and we don't want the Betsy DeVosses and those people deciding for us. We do things our way here in Kentucky, and John Kuhn has a Substack blog, and he's the superintendent of schools in Abilene, Texas, and he talks about this too. And it's like there's no private school there, and yet there's this push, and it's a very conservative area. But what really works for him is like, people don't want, the community does not want to see the destruction of Abilene High and the football team. Like, so sometimes it's even getting people to sort of recognize it. It's like, it's everyone in the town goes to the Friday nights, right, in Texas. And so, and I guess in Indiana, it's probably basketball, right? Well, now it's football too, actually, right? So it's people sort of embrace their schools in a way that's different, and they don't want to see it destroyed. And I also know, like, some of my friends who started off with sort of a, I really like, and I agree with Josh. Like, I think that the inter-district choice, there is choice, but what they don't like is that their friends' kids are getting pulled away, right? And it's destroying community. So they really have huge issues with that as well.
Yeah, and I think that, and not to be the stereotypical marketing guy on the show, but I think it comes back to the messaging always. Like, and this is gonna be always a bit of my take, but I think that we, as a party, we overthink things a lot more than the red side does. Like, I think the red side, I mean, we can see it very clearly with our current president, right? Like, he doesn't think at all. He just says shit, But we don't have to go to that extreme, but I think we overthink everything to an extent where it's debilitating instead of talking to people about what they're struggling with and connecting with them on what they're dealing with and helping to provide or communicate what the problem is and communicate the solutions to that problem. Like, that is where we need to be, and we need to connect then the messaging of it. Like, Josh, you were saying, like, if we can't message against the absolute utter shit that's out, like, they literally have Nazi slogans taped, like, not taped up, printed out and splattered everywhere. Like, if we can't beat that, then what are we doing? Right? Like, we have to message better just across the board. And I think at some point we overthink the complexity of things, and we over assume how much we need to explain something, when really we just need to not make it on the 9th page. We just need to mention it, and talk about it in a way that's going to connect with people. Yeah. I'm curious. Mary's having some technical issues on her end, but I want to open this up for the chat. We still have some people here. I want to open up a Q&A for people to ask questions for people, and I'll pop them up, and whoever wants to jump in can jump in. So our first question, do we have strategy for appeasing parents who want more visibility on what is being taught to their kids and the non-curriculum activities and discussions that take place?
I would just go back to this point I made earlier that we can't gaslight parents, and parents are partners in education policy, as are educators, teachers. This is not exclusively a Democratic problem. In fact, I would argue it's mostly a Republican problem, at least historically, when it comes to like school grades and accountability and all that business. But got to make school policy with parents and with educators, not on them, not to them. And so I think that's an important piece. And the reality is, like, there is a room for parents to contribute to those conversations. It starts with talking to your legislatures. It starts with talking to your school boards and participating in those elections. Different states vary. I don't know if you guys have a statewide curriculum or not. But the process is there, and being open to it is an important one. And just again, like, some of this is just letting parents and educators both, for different reasons, know they're at the table.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything else to add here before we move on to what's probably going to be our last question here?
Yeah, I've seen it in terms of curriculum and things like that are taking place. I've seen it work really well where specific schools will invite not all the parents on one night, but a certain subset, maybe a grade of parents on a night, to talk them through and show them, maybe if they have like a math initiative in that school or in the district, or a literacy initiative, whatever the focus is, they bring families in for a family night and they teach them a sort of in a meta way as they teach the kids, to get the parents buy into the curriculum. Is you see way more achievement because now the parents are going to be working with their kids at home. It's not just a worksheet that's sent home or a piece of paper that's emailed saying, hey, this is the unit we're on. And they provide childcare so that the parents can really focus in, and it's an hour and that's it. So I think that there's definitely things that we can be doing at the school level, supported by districts, supported by states, that would really bring families and parents into the conversation, having them partner, and showing that the school and the parents are not at odds with each other, because I know especially in special education, people feel like that a lot.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that that's a great opportunity for candidates too, like to partner with their local districts and teachers and whoever they can. Like, there's really only so much you're going to be able to do as a candidate. So partnering with people who are actually making a difference, and not that you're not, but who are making a difference and making an impact in ways that you can't, it makes one, makes you look really good, and two, makes a big difference for your community.
It's tangible.
Yeah. Any last thoughts before we wrap up? Because I don't want to keep anybody here too long. All right. Well, other than Mary being mute, thank you guys so much all for joining us for our first episode of the Power Hour. Thank you all for joining us.
Josh, can I say one thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just want to give a shout out to Mary for all the great work you're doing there in Indiana, and Devon for running for office, and Josh for his awesome book. And also, I just want to, Josh, you missed me saying this, but you then spoke to it, which was this issue of getting kids raised from the 10th item on page 4 to a more focused thing. And I love your interviews, because in your 5 questions, you're always asking an education kid question. And and what I was saying before you got on was that kids are so often invisible in these discussions. So very much appreciate all of you for, raising these issues, because
Well, I appreciate that. There's a whole bunch of new ones coming up, and I would just say, you know, like hopefully this conversation and conversations like that are taken as part of trying to be part of the solution. Like I know there's probably there's no shortage of opinions about like what Democrats need to do and what how to do messages and who was right and who was wrong in 24 and all that business. And like at least for my part, and I don't think with yours, Bruce, and others here, like we're trying to do that. Like what this is like, and frankly, like what's the worst case scenario if we are like somebody's got to do it when we're talking about kids and when we're talking about families and the work you're doing, Bruce, as well. Like if somebody says I'm being too aggressive in defending the place of kids and families as a Democratic agenda item, then if that's wrong, I don't want to be right? You know what I mean? So, but I don't think it's wrong. I think it's actually really important. I think it's the right thing to do, but I also think strategically it's an important thing to do to get back where we need to be. So,
me too.